We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters. Brought to you by AJ Bell.
Hi, and welcome to the AJ Bell Money Matters podcast. I'm Laura, and joining me is Danni. Hi, Danni.
Hi, Laura. Hi, everyone. So this podcast is all about women's finances. And because our financial lives are different to men's, there is a huge gender investment gap. Pensions, of course, being one of our biggest investments. So this episode could be a really useful one if you've ever taken time out of the workplace or worked part-time for a few years, because we are just over 6 months away from the deadline to make sure that you will be entitled to the full state pension when you retire.
This is a really important deadline for lots of women, so we'll talk you through how you can make sure you've paid enough national insurance over your working life, and also how you can plug any gaps back to 2006, but only up until April next year.
And we are delighted that our founding ambassador, Baroness Helena Morrissey, is back with us on this episode. And we have persuaded her to share some of her secrets about juggling finances with a large family. You might not know, but Helena has 9 children. So she's had to get creative along the way. And it was really nice to hear that even a city superwoman second guesses herself sometimes.
But let's start with that state pension information. So let's go back to basics. The new state pension is a regular weekly payment that you get from the government, available to most individuals in later life. It was introduced in 2016 to simplify how the state pension works, although I think some elements we're going to talk through show that it's not 100% simple, but it's simpler than the old system. You can claim it once you've reached state pension age and you have a minimum of 10 years of national insurance contributions. And so those able to claim the new state pension will be men born on or after the 6th of April 1951 and women born on or after the 6th of April 1953. If you were born before that, then you'll receive the old state pension, which we'll set aside for today because it gets pretty complicated. But at the moment, the new state pension is the grand sum of £221.20 a week, which works out at about just over £11,500 a year. It is going to go up by 4% in April next year, and so it will be worth almost £12,000 a year from that point. To be eligible for the state pension, you have to have reached state pension age, which is at 66 for both men and women at the moment, but it is rising. So if you're a bit further out from retirement, there are scheduled increases. So between 2026 and 28, it's going to rise to the age of 67. And then later on, there's going to be another hike to 68, which is going to occur around 2044 to 46. But obviously, because that's so far out, government might bring that forward or adjust those deadlines. But just the general trend is that you have to be slightly older before you're eligible for it. And you have to be eligible for the state pension based on your national insurance contributions. And so it depends how many years of national insurance contributions you've got as to whether you get that full amount or not. To get the full amount, you have to have at least 35 years of national insurance contributions. If you have less than that, then it will be adjusted accordingly.
Now, the next bit is really important because if you have ever taken time out of the workplace, say for caring responsibilities, to look after kids or older parents, if you've worked part-time and your wage for any of those years was under £6,396, then you might have a few gaps in your contributions. Now, some of those gaps might actually have been filled in. For example, that part-time work happened when you were looking after a child under the age of 12 and you were claiming child benefit. If you were on maternity leave or you registered as a carer, but some gaps might not have been. Now, thankfully, you can fill in the gaps, effectively buying up extra years of national insurance contributions. They're voluntary contributions known as Class 3 contributions, and that'll help you build up your entitlement. But this is the important date. because after the 5th of April next year, so just over 6 months from when we are recording this episode, after the 5th of April 2025, you will only be able to fill the gaps from the previous 6 years. However, for the next 6 months, transitional arrangements remain in place. So that means that you can plug those gaps all the way back to 2006. So this is really important that you don't put this on the back burner. If you think you might not have the full 35 years of national insurance contributions in place, and our research has found that women do take more time out of the workplace than men to have kids, look after kids, care for older parents. Our Financial Wobbly Bits report found out that 15% of women stepped back out of the workplace entirely after having kids, and almost 20% cut their hours back. In fact, only 55% of women surveyed went back to work full-time after their first child versus 92% of men. And for a second and third child, that number dropped further.
So the first thing that you need to do is check your national insurance contribution history. Now, you can do this via the government website. You can access your record online, but you might need to sign up to a government gateway. If you don't already have one of those government gateway IDs, then you might need to apply for one of those, or you can get a printed statement by post. So once you've done that, it's then worth checking with the Future Pension Centre, which is part of the DWP, because in some cases, filling in certain blanks won't have any impact on your state pension. So you need to double check things. So the years that you've been out of the workplace looking after children under the age of 12 and claiming child benefit, you need to make sure that that's been registered accurately on your national insurance record, because you want to make sure that paying for those additional years actually makes sense, because it's not cheap. So if you wanted to plug the gap for this whole tax year, for example, then it would cost you £907.40. Now, the amount varies depending on which year you're plugging, but as you can see, it's not a small amount of money. And so you want to make sure that it makes sense and that you definitely need to pay to plug that year. And it's not just due to an error on your record. So you need to work out how much extra you'd get on the state pension when you retire if you did plug that gap of that 1 year, for example, and then what the break-even figure is of how many years you'd need to receive that higher state pension as to whether it is worth paying to plug that gap. But if you have gaps and you don't deal with it in the next few months, then you do lose that opportunity of going back further. So you can still go back 6 years, but you can't go, like Danni said, all the way back to 2006. So it's definitely worth checking your record at the moment and factoring in how much left you've got of your working life and whether you need to plug those gaps.
It was a topic that came up during one of the webinars that we did for Noon this summer, and it sort of resonated with me, and a lot of women on the webinar at the time hadn't heard this. So we thought that it was a really useful topic to bring to you all. And if you do have any other suggestions of topics you'd like us to cover, get in touch. You can email us hello@ajbellmoneymatters.co.uk, message us on social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and X. We would love to hear from you. And if you sign up to our newsletter via our website and join the community, then you'll hear all about all of our webinars and articles.
Now it's time for our special guest, and Baroness Helena Morrissey has been hugely influential in our Money Matters campaign. She's our founding ambassador, but she's also chair of the Diversity Project and founder of the 30% Club. In this episode, she's actually not talking about her amazing career or all of the work that she's done to get more women engaged in finances. This time she's actually talking about her home life, because I know I am fascinated with how she juggles having 9 children with a very impressive career. But not only that, the finances of having 9 children. She's been the main breadwinner for the majority of her career. And so juggling all of those elements, I think, is really interesting, even to those of us who don't have 9 children. She's got some really great tips to listen to. And it's nice to hear that even often she's referred to as a superwoman. Even superwomen like Helena have the same insecurities as the rest of us.
Helena, it's absolutely lovely to have you joining us on the podcast. I'm sure lots of our regular listeners will have heard from you before. They will know that you're our founding ambassador and work very closely with us on Money Matters. Now, one thing that they might not know about you is that you're a mum of how many kids?
It's nine, yes. 6 girls, 3 boys. And just because everybody always asks, there's no twins or triplets, and we're not Catholic. But they just happen to enjoy having a big family.
I would imagine that this is something that you get asked about a lot, because although it wasn't that unusual a generation ago, nowadays it is quite unusual.
Yes, and I think I don't mind being asked about it. I mean, sometimes people say, oh, isn't it terribly sexist that people are always asking you, but they wouldn't ask if it was a man. But it's become a big part of, it is a big part of my identity, obviously, but also I hope, obviously as a working mother, someone who's sort of had a career and a big family, then I hope that shows other people it's doable, even if it's not for everybody. It's not what everybody wants, but certainly, and also it doesn't always go smoothly, of course, but we have our moments, that's for sure, in our family and obviously at work, but it is possible if that's what you want to do.
Possible, but I would imagine also incredibly difficult, not just in terms of logistics and emotions, but also in terms of finances. I mean, trying to cover the cost of all of that childcare, all of those schooling costs, how was it possible?
So I think, when I look back now, I think, goodness, if we had 9 young children now and we're thinking about things like school fees with VAT, obviously not everyone educates their children privately. I just don't think we would have been able to countenance it. So there is a sort of time and a place. But I guess one of the things I would emphasize is that when I only had one child, and I was passed over for promotion, actually, and told it was because I had a baby a long time ago now. That baby is now 32 with a child of his own. It really did make me determined to get a pay rise, get promoted. It actually made me, I don't think I would describe myself, and I have a lot of flaws, but I don't think I am a materialistic type of person, but I really needed the money. And it actually made me very conscious of making sure I didn't sort of lose out financially, which I think a lot of women, we get a bit nervous about talking about money. So that was a good thing. It really made me hungry for responsibility, promotions, being valued. And even if you have no children whatsoever, I think that's an important thing for everybody to do, to make sure you are given, what you deserve in terms of putting in the work and then being paid for it.
And without being given those promotions, without having the extraordinary career that you have had, financially, I would imagine that having 9 children would have been impossible.
Yes, and to be honest, I guess the big part of our story as well in our family is that since we had 4 children, and again, my children are quite grown up now, my youngest is 15, this 4th child is now 25, my husband decided that he would go freelance. He was a journalist. And so he effectively gave up full-time employment. And that was really because we were struggling as a family. It is very hard work if you're both working full-time and you're trying to bring up children. And obviously, if you have a lot of children, and I'm often asked about this actually, is it possible to have 2 people in a high-powered couple, both working full-time? And I say, sure, but if you have 9 children, probably not. But at 4, we took the gamble, and it was a financial gamble, Danni. So at that stage, I wasn't really earning enough to cover everything. But again, it motivated me to actually get that next promotion. And so, yes, it became a little bit of slight chicken and egg thing, that we'd have the baby and then I would make sure that there was enough money coming in the door. It's probably not the most sound way to plan financially. And of course, at this stage in my life, now that I'm not working full time in an executive role, and we still have, children these days, obviously it's very hard to be fully independent financially at an earlier age in the way that probably I was and you might have been, Danni. But now we find, it is, I have to think very carefully about it. I have to think, actually, can we go on holiday? It becomes so that it's a very much a sort of spreadsheet comes out, and I budget quite rigorously to make sure we don't run out.
They say necessity is the mother of invention, and I certainly found that. And you talking about spreadsheets then, it reminds me of a time when I've got two teenagers. The eldest is about to turn 18, the youngest is 16, and childcare over the summer holidays. That is when I would have to get my spreadsheet out, not only to budget for it, but just the logistics of it. With 9 children, things like holidays, things like fairness, things like making sure that you are able to give each of your children the same advantages that the previous ones got, that has to come with quite a lot of guilt, if not everything else.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely had a spreadsheet for the summer holidays. Each week was mapped out who was doing what. And sometimes we would book one child on 2 camps and another child not on any camps at all. I mean, I did make mistakes. Normally everyone was very understanding and let me switch it all around. But yes, you have to be quite organized. And as you say, necessity is a mother of invention. I think on the guilt thing, I certainly don't have a simple answer to that, because clearly it's almost impossible. Well, it is impossible to give 9 children equal amount of attention all of the time. So what's ended up happening, I suppose, is that, again, you prioritize according to, it's not just the physical needs, like someone's, going to do a ballet show and you really want to get there, but also the emotional needs. And, when someone's slightly struggling or needs extra help with their homework, say, I guess we just ended up, we definitely lost sight of any kind of perfectionist trait. It was really just trying our best. And I suppose that's my advice for any parent, whether working outside the home or not, because all parents work, is we end up beating ourselves up a lot, I think, for the things that we haven't been able to do, or the things that we kind of know we kind of corner around just to make it all add up that day. And sometimes you just have to accept you're doing your best. And I guess I got better at that. I got better at, silencing that little voice in my head saying, oh, if only, I had this extra hour in the day, because I didn't. So I would just try to make each hour, as good as it could be. And then sometimes, obviously, we also need to relax and, just hang out together. I think that's the other thing I've learned. I'm not very good at relaxing. I'm terrible at relaxing. But, as you get slightly older, and also, well, even just when you get tired, it's very important to spend time just being with your children, not necessarily rushing around doing something with them. So that, I suppose, I've learned to be better at.
So there'll be a lot of women listening to this that have children or are thinking of having children. What tips would you give them? Things that you've learnt over that period of time. Your eldest is in their 30s now, you say. So that's a good 30-year chunk of time when you've learned every step of the way. What tips could you give people to have a smoother financial journey?
So I think sometimes we spend a lot of anxious moments really worrying about everything that can go wrong. And I think even as a parent, just full stop, it's very difficult to live your life if you're constantly in a state of anxiety. So I think, and I think I could have been quite a nervous sort of person, but reality is that I just have to do things every day, and there isn't so much time for worrying and getting anxious. I've seen a lot of women in particular, but I'm sure it happens to men as well, being very concerned about the next phase. So they get to relive it, or they live it in advance rather, before it's even happened. And they start thinking, how are we going to afford this? How are we going to afford that? And although it's good to have some sort of sense of a vague plan out there and thinking like I did, actually, by the time this happens, I'm going to need to earn an extra £10,000 a year or whatever it might be. There's also a need to accept that actually, you take it one step at a time. And when I learned to do that better, and I had some great advice, the best advice I was ever given was when I was beating myself up about never being in the right place at the right time. At work, I felt I should be at home, and at home, I felt I should be at work. And a woman who was more senior than me said, look, Helena, I was in the same place as you. And then one day I realized I had to decide to live the life I was leading. I had chosen a path. I should take it. I shouldn't constantly look over my shoulder at things I might do differently. So again, I've learned to try to let go of those anxieties about the next phase and just try to celebrate those moments as they come. And I do think financially, we can end up talking ourselves out of doing anything these days. I mean, I know so many people who say, I don't think I can afford to have a child. And then I sit down with them when we go through it. Obviously, having a child is very expensive. So I'm not in any way glossing over, build it and they will come about the money side. But there is a point where you have to decide what you want to prioritize in life. And then, as I say, you've made that decision and then you make the best of it. And it might not always go smoothly, but that's really helped me.
Really interesting that you say that women spend time thinking about the next period of their lives. I'm certainly guilty of that. And my eldest is about to start university and I haven't set aside cash to cover. I didn't even think about having to cover accommodation costs and that kind of thing. And of course, I'm now working in an environment with lots of really smart women in the Money Matters team who work in financial services, who are young, who are already thinking about those building blocks. And you're right. It is so hard if you haven't thought about them ahead of time, not to worry about them as they're hurtling towards you.
Yes. And I mean, I think these days, one of my children who's at university, very sweetly, she's sort of signed up to be a student ambassador at her university, which is a paid role. And she's very proud of being able to cover, certainly have food bills every month. I pay the rent, she pays the food, but I think it's important that we try to educate our children along the way, that we're not, especially when they're older, they're late teens, early 20s, that actually they may be able to earn some money towards their keep. And it's a great part of your education. I think perhaps not enough attention is spent on it. But we really do need to help our children understand, how valuable money is and how they can earn their own way in life. So I find, yes, don't think it's all on your shoulders, Danni. Maybe a little part-time job or a Saturday job or helping out. It definitely teaches you so much. We've all done that first holiday job or Saturday job, and you learn about the world of work as well as about money.
Both mine now have cash coming in, and that means that the number of parcels coming through the door has trebled.
Yeah, there is that. It's a lot easier now to do online shopping. When I was a teenager, no such thing existed, and I'm very grateful now. That meant I had to save up my summer holiday money for university.
If you could give a young woman a blueprint that they could follow to try, obviously everyone's path is different and there will be things that will come along and knock you off the path. So, you can't plan for everything, but there are certain things that you can plan for. What would you suggest women could do ahead of having children to make sure that they are in that best place?
So I think being really clear about your priorities first and foremost. So if you do want to have children, then decide that is something you want to aim for, and therefore work backwards from, what kind of job might you have to be able to finance that. Obviously, people can take some time out as well to look after their child when they're small, and that is an amazing thing to do and what everyone used to do. So I'm not in any way saying that you should always work, obviously, but I think it's very important to think about actually what kind of job would you want to have to be able to afford that. And I think let's not beat about the bush. Let's not assume that you marry or have a partner, somebody who's going to look after you and your child or your children. I think it's very, very empowering and fulfilling to be self-sufficient if you can. And I've got friends who, have got very wealthy husbands, but they have everything bought for them. And I wouldn't like that. I mean, again, for me, that would have been problematic, I think, in terms of me feeling a sense of self-worth. And I think then, as I said earlier, take it one step at a time. You don't have to be thinking actually, and it's very important chronologically. We have a body clock. I know you can freeze eggs and so forth these days. But again, I think the reason, most people, we're sort of designed to have children young. Obviously, you can have them now into your 40s and that's medically possible. And it might be the only time when you can afford it. But I think if you can have them earlier and want to have them earlier, then again, you don't have to have everything perfect. So we have, my husband and I definitely struggled at certain points. When we got married and had our first child, mortgage rates were double digits. We think we've got high interest rates now, but we had a really, really spike in interest rates. And we had negative equity in our flat. So we had a double whammy there. And we had nursery fees. So if we added it all up, we had more money going out each month than coming in. And people might say, well, that was very sort of daft of you to do that. You shouldn't have got yourselves in that position. But of course, life happens. And as I've explained, the thing is, and it makes you very determined, in our case, to overcome that problem. So again, if you are young, take it one step at a time, decide what your priorities are, and just try to make sure you're not always putting things off. It's like perfection is the, enemy of good, isn't it? You don't have to have everything perfect. You don't have to have a beautifully decorated nursery to have a happy baby. You can have things that are slightly less, than perfect, or else very far from perfect, but everyone's happy and enjoying their lives. So work out what's important to you and then what you'll need to do to achieve those things.
Yeah, perfect. It is incredibly hard. And I think social media makes it harder.
Definitely. I think people have this idea that, well, the money comes easily, which it obviously doesn't. And I should have explained, I'm a daughter of teachers. I had a modest background. I went to state school. I'm not born with money. So I was very conscious of how difficult it is to earn money and how things are luxuries. When I was a child, we went to holiday in Wales every year, which I really enjoyed. It was my godmother's little cottage and we had a lot of fun, but it certainly wasn't a luxury holiday. And that sort of thing, I had to choose these shoes or those boots. I couldn't have both. I had friends who could just have anything. And it does make you appreciative. I think I certainly don't have any complaints about my childhood. So I think social media does give this image that everything is easily affordable and luxury is the norm. And that's pernicious. That's not the way it is. I think, again, it's up to us as parents and including our daughters who might be thinking about their next stage in life to encourage them to enjoy what we have rather than, aspire to something that's completely unobtainable. And, not to think it all depends on being able to afford everything. As I said earlier, we can get by with relatively little. And we've actually, when I look back, some of the most fun times we've had as a family have been actually the most low-key, inexpensive times, like family Christmases that have been almost like camping because, we hadn't got any rooms decorated and we had to hire trestle tables. I mean, it was fun, but it wasn't perfect and it wasn't glamorous.
I think a lot of people will really be appreciative of hearing that, because I think the last couple of years in particular has been incredibly hard for lots of people. But in many ways, it has changed the conversation. It's made talking about money less of a taboo. We've all felt in it together. And I know so many women now that have WhatsApp groups where they're discussing, ways to be able to keep things less expensive, places to invest money, things like pensions that weren't really part of a conversation that you would have with your mates. Now we're having those conversations. So I suppose in some ways, maybe the last couple of years, that's the silver lining.
Yes, I do think talking about money is absolutely critical, especially when, we are in tougher environments. And I do think you're right that it's not been easy for many people. And obviously we've had inflation. We've got worries about economic growth. Now we've got worries about taxes. There's a whole sort of melting pot of anxieties there. And I think it's good that people are now raising their concerns. The key with money problems or to preempt money problems is to think in advance a little bit. And that's, again, where I come back with a spreadsheet. If you know there's going to be a tight month or year or whatever the time frame might be, then it doesn't mean that you're going to solve it all in one fell swoop by just writing it all out and sort of make yourself even more scared about the numbers. But it really makes you get on top of it. So, if you have a big tax bill looming, or if you have, some university fees, as we talked about, scoping it out and not putting your head in the sand and perhaps discussing it with others who might be in a similar boat is if not liberating, then it certainly puts you on a path to solving the problem. Because, you can at least, these days as well, banks, if you need a temporary like overdraft or something, are much more accommodating because they have seen people, not just a cash flow issue sometimes, they might have some money coming in, particularly with people working in a sometimes often quite self-employed way these days. And they will be more sympathetic, as my experience, to, okay, got a short-term cash flow need, but planning it and not waking up one day looking at bank balance and thinking, yikes, how are we going to get through the week, will really help to alleviate the stress.
Just finally, is there a thought to leave people with? If you were doing it all again, are there any things that you would have done differently?
Well, I definitely, obviously, my children might be listening to this. Definitely wouldn't have said, "Oh no, it would be much easier with fewer children." Clearly, in my case, and I know it's a little unusual these days. I appreciate that it might seem being very self-indulgent to have so many children, but it definitely is financially challenging sometimes. And I certainly wouldn't do it differently, but I think I would have perhaps planned a little bit more at the start. I was 25 when I had my first child and felt we were always scrabbling to catch up, whether it was nursery fees, whether it was then school fees, because we really wanted to educate our children. We're living in London and we wanted to send them to good schools. So I always felt that we were slightly behind where we needed to be. And I guess that's one lesson learned. And as I look at my children, I think they're more sensible than me. They'll be thinking, actually, let's make sure we've got some financially sort of bit stable. I was still on my first job when I had a child. So really hadn't really got anywhere on my career. So I think that's perhaps something that I would pass on to the next generation. But I would also say, if you're really determined, if you really want to have a family and a career, I'm not an anomaly. I mean, I meet people all the time. Last week I was talking to a young woman who has 4. She said, "I'd really like to have a 5th. And I know it wouldn't be sort of seen as acceptable and, it's unusual. But sometimes, if you can afford it or you're making plans so that you can get there, you only have the one life." I know it's a cliche to say it, but, my family now brings me huge joy. Always has brought me great joy, even at the most sort of difficult, stressful times. I have 4 grandchildren who obviously I adore. And that has been a huge, huge part of my life. And I can't envisage it any other way. Obviously, I appreciate that it's not for everybody, but if you work out you want no children or you want 6, there's a way to make it, as long as you physically are able to. So I guess at the end of it, it does make me a bit sad sometimes when I see people sort of thinking in advance, "Oh, we just can't have a child because we can't afford it." And you think, that is a shame. If you decide never to have a child because of finances, ideally that wouldn't be happening to anybody.
So Helena Morrissey there, really amazing woman, and quite a few confessions in that. But did she leave us with a personal finance confession for the end?
She did, and it's one that really does prove that we are all in the same boat when it comes to our finances.
I should have prepared this, shouldn't I? So I guess one of the things that I actually did start investing in the stock market pretty late. So you might think again, as you said about your child's university accommodation, you think if you work in finance, you're going to be right on it. I was a fixed income fund manager, so I knew all about the power of compounding and leaving money in the market, etc. But as I've mentioned already, a lot of my early years were very much covering immediate costs. And so I got around to it rather late. And I think actually that's not uncommon when we compare notes, that actually people who work in finance often don't look after their own money as well as they should. So I have learned to get on top of it. And actually the lockdown, terrible in so many ways, was the time when I, just like many other people in the country, thought, finally, I'm going to get to grips with it. I'm going to get to grips with my pension. I'm going to gather the parts from different sources. So I think that was a blessing for me. I'm not sure. I mean, I was just approaching 55 and it was the moment to do it. So yes, like everybody else, I have had my chaotic moments about money. And these days I am much more disciplined. I try to set an hour aside at the weekends, not every weekend, but just to kind of get on top of money issues. And that would be my other side to my confession. I'm a reformed character on that front now. So I try to, for example, taxes always drive me nuts because I have different sources of income. So now I'm trying to do them in October this year, not January the 20th.
It's that classic line of doctors making the worst patients as people in the finance industry, knowing that they need to sort their finances and engage with their pension and things like that, but not quite getting around to it. Maybe partly it's because it feels a bit too much like work at the end of the workday.
I think you're absolutely spot on with that. Although, having said that, on the flip side, since I joined financial services, I've learned more about it. I'm more comfortable with it. And I've been really impressed by how a lot of the younger members of the Money Matter team are just totally on it. But that is it for this episode. As we said earlier, do get in touch if you have any suggestions of guests you'd like us to speak to or topics you would like us to tackle.
And our next episode will feature the team behind the podcast The Wobbly Middle, talking all about midlife career changes. So we hope you'll listen to that. Subscribe to the podcast to make sure that you don't miss an episode, and tell your friends and family. And you can also sign up to the newsletter on the Money Matters website, which is ajbellmoneymatters.co.uk, so you don't miss a thing. And we'll see you next time.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you if a certain investment is suitable or not. Don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that how you're taxed will depend on your individual circumstances, and rules can change. The way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.